The sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the underground garage, and though the polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, there was a shadow that lingered, thick and unsettling. The company's luxury sedans were lined in neat order, each waiting like loyal soldiers for their masters. Drivers in clean suits leaned against doors, checking their watches, their eyes shifting nervously as the CEO of Dawson and Miles Corporation descended the staircase with his briefcase. His presence was enough to send a ripple of silence through the room. He was a man who commanded authority wherever he went, and no one dared breathe too loudly when he was near. But that silence cracked when a black boy's voice pierced the air. "Don't get in the car." The words were not polished. They were raw, desperate, carrying a kind of urgency that couldn't be rehearsed. They didn't belong in that space of wealth and power, and yet they landed with such force that every head turned. The black boy was no more than 12, his skin a deep shade of brown that seemed to glow beneath the dim lights, his small frame swallowed by an oversized hoodie that had been washed so many times the fabric looked tired. He stood there, clutching his mother's cleaning cart as if it were his shield. His eyes wide, unblinking, locked on the CEO. The CEO froze mid-step, his polished Italian shoes glinting under the lights. For a heartbeat, confusion crossed his face. Then came irritation. He was not a man accustomed to being told what to do, least of all by a child. "Excuse me?" His voice cut, sharp, like a blade slicing the silence, but the boy didn't flinch. His voice wavered, but carried a courage far greater than his years. "Please, sir, don't get in that car." Gasps fluttered among the staff. The drivers exchanged uneasy glances. The janitor standing at the far wall stiffened, already fearing what would happen next. The black boy's mother, a cleaner in her faded uniform, dropped the rag she'd been holding. Her face turned pale, and her lips trembled. "James," she whispered sharply. "Enough!" She pulled him close, whispering in his ear, begging him to stay quiet. But James shook his head, his small hands curling into fists. His mother's fear did not reach him. Something deeper compelled him to speak. The CEO's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he walked closer. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. He stopped right in front of James, towering over him, his cologne lingering in the air like power itself. "And why?" he asked slowly. "Shouldn't I get into my own car?" The black boy swallowed. His throat burned, but he stood tall, his voice steady now. "Because it's not just a car, it's a trap. They want you to leave in it so they can blame you. Please, don't." A heavy silence swallowed the room. The words hung in the air, absurd to some, dangerous to others. The CEO's assistant shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening on the files he carried. A driver looked away, his jaw clenching. The cleaner, the black boy's mother, shook her head violently, as if hoping the ground would open and swallow them both before this moment got any worse. But the CEO didn't move, his gaze fixed on the black boy, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. That was how it began, one voice, small but unshakable, standing against the weight of a corporation, against years of hierarchy and silence. That was the moment when the walls of Dawson and Miles began to crack. James was not supposed to be there. Children of cleaners were not meant to linger in corporate hallways. They were ghosts seen but ignored, existing in the shadows while their parents scrubbed away the mess of the powerful. His mother, Evelyn, had been with the company for 10 years. Every evening after school, James would wait in the break room while she worked late shifts. Sometimes he would help her push the mop, not because she asked him to, but because he hated to see her bend until her back ached. He knew what it felt like to be invisible. He knew what it was like for people to walk past without ever saying hello, to avoid his eyes as if acknowledging him meant acknowledging the reality they wanted to ignore. But invisibility had its advantages. James listened when others spoke carelessly. He noticed details that others dismissed. He saw things most didn't bother to see, and one evening he had seen something that unsettled him so deeply he could not keep it buried. That morning had been like any other. Evelyn woke James at dawn, her voice tired but warm, urging him to hurry or they would miss the bus. Their tiny apartment was barely enough for the two of them, but she made it feel like home. The walls carried laughter despite the cracks in the paint. The fridge was never full, but James always ate before she did. At school, James was quiet, often lost in thought. Teachers called him distracted, classmates called him strange, but his mother called him special. He carried a notebook everywhere, filling it with sketches, questions, and words he overheard. He noticed things the way people's eyes darted when they lied, the way silence often screamed louder than noise. That day, when his mother picked him up after school, she was quieter than usual. Her face carried the weight of something unsaid. She walked faster, gripping his hand tighter, as if worried he might slip away. At the company building, James slipped away from the break room. He often did. He roamed the hallways when the office emptied, the marble floors cool under his sneakers, the walls echoing with whispers of deals and secrets. That's when he stumbled into the garage. At first, it was just cars, rows and rows of sleek machines gleaming like jewels. But then he noticed something. A man in a suit leaned against one of the CEO's cars, speaking hurriedly into his phone. His voice was low, but James caught fragments. "Tonight, he'll take it himself. The papers are inside. There's no turning back." The man glanced around, slipping an envelope into the glove compartment before walking away. His eyes darted nervously, his shoulders tense. James ducked behind a pillar, his heart thumping. He didn't understand everything, but he knew enough. Something was wrong, something hidden, and it was waiting inside that car. That's why when the moment came, when the CEO approached the car, James couldn't stay silent. His voice broke through because silence would have been worse. The CEO didn't know it yet, but that black boy's words would unravel everything. The lies, the betrayals, the rot within his own empire. And in the end, it would not be the boardroom or the shareholders who would change the course of the company. It would be the cleaner's black son who dared to yell 4 simple words. The CEO did not climb into the car that night. His instincts told him to dismiss the black boy's words as childish nonsense, but something in James's eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't arrogance. It was the kind of conviction that came only when truth burned too heavy to be hidden. He had seen thousands of people plead their cases in boardrooms, in negotiations, in desperate bids for approval. But none of them had ever looked at him the way this boy did, with fear and courage interwoven, as though speaking might cost him everything, but silence would cost even more. So instead of unlocking the door, the CEO turned slowly, his hand still resting on the polished chrome handle. "What did you say was in this car?" His tone was calm, but sharp enough to slice through the air. James's mouth went dry. He hadn't expected to be questioned. His chest rose and fell quickly, but he forced himself to speak. "I heard a man. He put something inside. He said you'd be blamed." The garage grew so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights felt deafening. A few staff members exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh, to scold, or to vanish before they were dragged into trouble. Evelyn trembled, clutching her son's shoulders, whispering apologies over and over. But James stood firm, even as his small body leaned against her for comfort. The CEO didn't shout. He didn't scoff. He just nodded to his head of security, a man built like stone, standing near the elevator. "Check it." The driver hurried forward, unlocking the car. For a long moment, there was only the sound of rummaging the glove compartment clicking open, the shuffle of papers, then silence and the faintest gasp. The security man emerged, his face pale. In his hand was a thick envelope, sealed, heavy, and stamped with the company's insignia. He handed it to the CEO without a word. The CEO's eyes lingered on the seal, then slowly tore it open. Papers slid out, and as his eyes scanned them, his expression hardened. They were contracts. Contracts with forged signatures, implicating him in a fraudulent deal worth millions. The kind of papers that, if discovered, could end his career, drag the company into ruin, and stain his name forever. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the garage. His employees avoided his eyes. His assistant fidgeted nervously. And there was the black boy, small and steady, staring back at him without fear. The CEO closed the envelope. His chest rose with a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt the floor shift beneath his feet, not from failure, not from competition, but from the realization that truth had nearly been buried under his own nose. He turned to James. "What is your name?" James swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "James, sir." "James," the CEO repeated, his tone softer now, as though committing it to memory. Then his eyes lifted to Evelyn, who looked ready to collapse. "And you are his mother?" "Yes, sir," she stammered. "I'm so sorry, sir. He doesn't understand." But the CEO raised a hand, silencing her. No, he understood something all of us ignored. His gaze lingered on James again, then shifted back to the car. "Lock it! No one touches this vehicle until I say otherwise." The staff scattered quickly, obeying orders. The CEO walked to the elevator without another word. But those who stood in the garage that night knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a black boy's courage, but a moment when power itself had bent not to wealth, not to influence, but to truth spoken by the least expected voice. That night, James lay awake in his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of their apartment. His mother hadn't scolded him, though her face carried both fear and wonder. She had simply hugged him tighter than ever before, whispering, "You don't know what you've done, James. You don't know." But James did know. He knew the car had been a trap. He knew his voice had mattered. Yet deep down, he also knew something larger was unfolding, something that had only begun. For the CEO, sleep did not come easily either. His mind replayed the moment over and over, the black boy's shout, the papers in his hands, the quiet courage in those young eyes. In his world, trust was currency, and betrayal lurked in every corner. He paid analysts, consultants, and advisors millions to protect him. Yet it was the son of a cleaner, someone invisible in his empire, who had protected him that night. And that thought unsettled him more than the betrayal itself. The following morning, the office buzzed with whispers. Rumors spread like wildfire. The CEO had halted his departure because of the cleaner's son. A secret had been uncovered. An envelope had been found. Nobody knew the details, but everybody talked. In companies like Dawson and Miles, secrets didn't stay hidden, they grew, twisting into legends. James arrived with his mother as usual, clutching his notebook. He kept his head low, but he could feel the stares. Some looked at him with pity, others with irritation, and a few with something close to respect. His mother walked faster than usual, as though speed could shield them from the weight of those eyes. But before she could reach the janitor's locker room, a voice called out, "Mrs. Carter." Evelyn froze. It was the CEO's assistant, standing stiffly in his pressed suit. His eyes flicked down to James, then back to her. "The CEO would like to see you, both of you." Her heart sank. This was it. She had dreaded this moment. She thought of termination papers, of humiliation, of walking out with her son's hand in hers and no paycheck to bring home. But she nodded quietly, tightening her grip on James. They were led into the top floor of an office unlike anything James had ever seen. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, the city skyline shimmering beyond. A desk carved from dark oak stood in the center, polished so well it reflected light like water. Behind it sat the CEO, his posture calm but unreadable. "Sit," he said, motioning to the chairs. Evelyn hesitated, then lowered herself onto the seat, keeping James close. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but the CEO raised his hand. "There's no need," he said firmly. "What your son did last night was not a mistake. It was extraordinary." Evelyn blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly. James shifted nervously in his chair, gripping his notebook tight. The CEO leaned forward, his hands clasped. "James, do you know what those papers meant? Do you understand what you stopped?" James hesitated, then shook his head. "Not everything, but I knew it was wrong. I knew it would hurt you." The CEO studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Not an education, not experience, just the courage to say, 'This is wrong.' That is something even men twice my age struggle to do." Evelyn's eyes softened with pride, though her lips trembled as though she might cry. The CEO sat back. "I don't know what others will say about this. I don't know what storms will come because of it. But I know this. I will not forget what you did." His gaze shifted between mother and son. "Neither of you will be invisible here anymore." Those words hung in the air, heavy with promise. For the first time, Evelyn felt seen, not as a cleaner, not as background, but as a person whose worth had been acknowledged by the man who ruled the company. And for James, those words became a spark, igniting something he didn't yet have a name for. But recognition comes with cost. By the end of that week, quiet resistance stirred within the company. Executives whispered about the black boy, about the CEO's strange attention. Some saw James as a threat, a reminder of truths they wanted buried. Others envied the respect the CEO had given him, respect they themselves had fought years to earn. And in the shadows, those who had planted the forged papers seethed. Their plan had been clean, perfect, until a child's voice had torn it apart. Now their secret is out, and secrets, once threatened, become dangerous. James had no idea of the storm that brewed. He only knew that his voice had mattered, and that realization would carry him into a place he never expected, a place where a cleaner's son would stand before the entire company, not as a shadow but as a light no one could ignore. As the CEO had promised, recognition did not stay hidden. It never does. In the world of gleaming skyscrapers and endless boardrooms, news moved faster than truth itself, carried on whispers, stretched into rumors, reshaped into weapons. Within days, the story of a cleaner's son halting the CEO's steps spread across the company. Some called it bravery, others called it foolishness, and some, behind closed doors, called it dangerous. For James, life changed in ways he could not yet understand. In the break room where he used to sit alone, people now glanced at him differently. Some smiled awkwardly, as though pitying him. Others narrowed their eyes, as if a black boy like him had no right to disturb the careful order of things. But every glance carried something new: awareness. He was no longer invisible. His mother, Evelyn, walked through hallways with her head lower than ever. Recognition frightened her. She had survived in this company for years by being unseen, by cleaning silently, by never drawing attention. To be seen now felt like standing in the center of a stage she never asked to stand on. Each nod from a colleague felt less like respect and more like scrutiny, as though they were asking themselves how long until she and her son would fall. But the CEO remembered his promise. On the third morning after the garage incident, he summoned James and Evelyn again. The same assistant led them to the towering office. This time, James wasn't trembling. He carried his notebook under his arm, clutching it like armor. The CEO rose from his desk when they entered, a gesture that startled Evelyn. Men like him didn't stand for cleaners, but he did. "James," he said warmly, "I owe you more than I can ever repay, but at the very least I can give you what you deserve, a voice." James blinked, unsure what he meant. The CEO gestured to the glass wall overlooking the city. "This company runs on voices that are too often lies. Men tell me what I want to hear, not what I need to hear. You told me what I needed, even though it could have cost you everything. That," he said firmly, "is leadership." Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. No one had ever called her son a leader. The CEO turned to her. "From now on, your shifts will end earlier. No more nights that keep you here until dawn. And James," he paused, meeting the boy's eyes, "I want you to sit in on one of our board meetings." The words landed like a thunderclap. Evelyn nearly stood, shaking her head. "Sir, he's only a child. He doesn't belong here." "He belongs here," the CEO interrupted. "Perhaps more than most of the men who sit at that table. He sees what others ignore. I want him there. Even if he speaks nothing, even if he only listens, I want him there." James's heart thumped so loudly he thought they could hear it. Him? In a board meeting? He had imagined boardrooms before, tall men in suits, long tables, voices rising and falling like storms, but never had he imagined himself sitting among them. Evelyn lowered her gaze, torn between fear and pride, but she nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, sir, it's what the company needs," the CEO said simply. The day of the board meeting arrived, and tension filled the air long before the room did. The directors, men with silver hair and sharp ties, women with cold eyes and sharper words, took their seats one by one. Each had built their reputation on control, on keeping the machinery of power running smoothly. And yet, when James walked into the room behind the CEO, every head turned. Whispers rose instantly. A child? Here? At the table of power? It was unthinkable. But the CEO did not falter. He motioned to a chair beside him, and James sat, clutching his notebook tightly, his feet dangling above the polished floor. The meeting began. Numbers were read, charts projected, voices droned on about profits and losses, expansions and risks. James listened. At first the words felt foreign, heavy with meanings he didn't fully grasp. But he watched their faces. He noticed how one director's eyes flickered whenever quarterly losses were mentioned. He saw the way another tapped her pen furiously whenever acquisitions were discussed. He wrote everything down, expressions, tones, silences, because James knew silence often carried more truth than words. Halfway through, the conversation turned to the forged contracts, the very papers found in the CEO's car. The room stiffened, words sharpened, questions hung in the air like daggers. How, one director demanded, did such documents reach your vehicle without your knowledge? Who had access? Another pressed. The CEO leaned back, his hands folded calmly. Someone with intent. Someone who hoped I would walk blindly into a trap. His eyes swept the table. But I didn't, because someone I should never have had to rely on saw what the rest of us didn't. And with that, he motioned to James. Every head turned. James's throat went dry. The CEO nodded at him gently. Tell them. James swallowed, then opened his notebook. His small voice wavered at first, but it carried through the room. I was in the garage. I saw a man. He was on the phone. He said something about tonight, about papers, about you. He put them in the car and left. That's why I yelled. The boardroom fell silent. Some scoffed quietly, shaking their heads. Others stared in disbelief. But none could ignore the fact that the CEO, the man whose word they could not challenge, had given his platform to a child. One director leaned forward, sneering. And we are to believe the word of a black boy, a cleaner's son? The word stung, slicing into the air like venom. Evelyn, sitting quietly at the far end as an observer, flinched. But James lifted his chin. His small hands gripped the notebook tighter, but his voice did not shake. You don't have to believe me, he said quietly, but I saw what you didn't. And if you'd been there, you would have seen it too. A hush fell. For a moment, the arrogance of the board was stripped bare by the simplicity of truth. The CEO leaned forward, his voice cold as steel. Do not mistake his age for weakness. He saw what all of you, with all your years of experience and education, failed to see. And that is why he is at this table, to remind us that wisdom does not wear a suit. No one dared respond. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The black boy who should have been invisible had been placed in the center of their world, and his presence exposed cracks they wanted hidden. But outside the boardroom, storms gathered. The executives whose plan had been undone whispered among themselves. How could a child destroy what they had carefully crafted? How could their careful betrayal collapse because of a black boy's voice? Their anger turned into resolve. If James had been a ghost before, now he was a target, and James felt it. In the days that followed, he noticed how some employees looked away quickly when he passed. Others whispered just loud enough for him to hear. Teacher's pet, they muttered. Cleaner's brat. But the worst was not the words. It was the silence of doors closing when he entered hallways, the silence of smiles fading when he looked up. Recognition had made him visible, but it had also made him vulnerable. At night, Evelyn sat at the edge of his bed, stroking his hair. I'm proud of you, she whispered, though her voice trembled with fear. But promise me something, James. Promise me you'll be careful. James nodded, but he didn't know how to be careful with the truth. Truth demanded a voice. Truth demanded courage. And deep down, James knew his story with the CEO had only begun. And so the company stood divided. On one side, those who admired the black boy's courage. On the other hand, those who resented it. In the middle stood the CEO, a man wrestling with his own awakening that sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from the top, but from the unseen voices below. What no one realized was this. The moment James shouted in the garage, Dawson and Miles stopped being just a corporation. It became a battlefield between arrogance and truth, between hierarchy and recognition. And the black boy who once pushed his mother's cleaning cart was now at the center of it all. Years later, James would grow older, his notebooks filling with ideas, sketches, and stories. He would go on to study law, not because he wanted to wear the title of lawyer, but because he had once seen how truth could save a man when shouted at the right moment. At his graduation, Evelyn stood in the front row, clapping through tears. Dawson, now retired, sent a letter of congratulations, calling him the black boy who saved a CEO and taught a company to listen. And James, he carried that story with him, not as a trophy but as a compass, because that night in the garage, he hadn't been a hero. He had simply been a black boy who refused to stay silent. And so in a world where silence often feels safer than truth, a cleaner son taught an empire to pause and to listen. His words echoed far beyond the garage that night. They became a reminder that courage is not measured by age, nor by status, but by the willingness to speak when no one else dares. If this story of how a single voice broke through power and pride touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to Colorless Voices, where untold stories like these remind us that dignity, courage, and truth can rise from anywhere.